A new book out today by CNBC's Andrew Ross Sorkin dives into America's most infamous stock market crash and the cast of characters responsible for ushering in the Great Depression. 1929, inside the greatest crash in Wall Street history and how it shattered a nation. Investigates what led up to the infamous Black Thursday and the alarming parallels to the past seen on Wall Street today. And Andrew joins us now. He's co-anchor of CNBC's Squawk Box and a New York Times columnist. And how long have you worked on this book?
I've been working on this for 8 years.
Yeah.
8 long years. So thank you for having me.
I mean, the details and the investigation, the extent you went to retrace this is just extraordinary. Tell our family.
Well, what I was trying to do,
this.
to be honest, I'd written Too Big to Fail about the financial crisis of 2008. And by the way, everyone was alive, so you could go interview them and try to bring the reader inside the room and tell it as a cinematic tale. We ultimately made a movie for HBO about it. And people would ask me about 1929. I knew something terrible had happened, but I didn't really know. And despite all the books that had been written about this period, nobody had really brought you in the room in sort of that tick-tock fashion. You know, I used to love books like Barbarians at the Gate and Den of Thieves and things like that, where you felt like you were there. And all I wanted to do was figure that out. And so one day I happened to be at Harvard University giving a speech. I was there early. I happened to walk into the Baker Library there, and I asked the archivist about these boxes that they had from a guy named Tom Lamont, who ran J.P. Morgan. And I'm opening the boxes, and his secretary was keeping transcripts of his phone calls between him and Hoover and him and Roosevelt. So you could actually see them talking to each other. And I thought, oh my goodness, okay, there could be a story here. And each of these people parallel today. There's a guy named Charlie Mitchell. He's like the Jamie Dimon of his time. He really invented modern credit in America, the reason why we all buy stocks and on leverage, unfortunately.
Right.
And he was up against a guy named Carter Glass, the senator from Virginia. Carter Glass was the Elizabeth Warren of his time, who would rail about this thing called Mitchellism and how he believed that Charlie Mitchell was going to ruin America because he was allowing people to speculate.
By the way, I don't know if Jamie Dimon would appreciate you comparing him
in terms of just
to Mr. Mitchell.
He was on the front pages of every newspaper magazine. I mean, he was known like that. And that was the other thing that was happening during this period. Just the CEOs were all of a sudden as famous as Babe Ruth.
You started the book, actually, and you draw the reader in immediately with Charlie Mitchell running up the steps, going in, trying to put on a brave face. Here's a man who knew, no doubt, they called him Mr. Sunshine.
Sunshine Charlie.
Sunshine Charlie. But Sunshine Charlie that day had a deep, dark secret and a doubt, and that's where the book begins. And that's where all of this starts unraveling. Talk about how Charlie Mitchell why he is still considered the man who may have been most responsible for the crash.
Well, so he ran a bank called National City. National City becomes Citigroup. By the way, for those of you who know New York, his home is now the French consulate. So that big, beautiful mansion on Fifth Avenue and 75th Street, that's where he lived. And he was on the board of the New York Fed, as well as running this big bank. And the same debates we're having today about raising interest rates, lowering interest rates, he was out there screaming, we need to lower interest rates, even in the face of all this speculation. He was lending money to people. Brokerage houses were emerging all over the country on the corners of streets like Starbucks. And you could go in, and it was because of Charlie Mitchell that you could put down $1 and they would lend you $10.
Right.
And by the way, everybody was doing this. Groucho Marx was doing this out in Long Island. And when the stock market crashed, it wasn't just that you lost the price of the stock going down. It was that you had borrowed so much money that you had none left.
You were leveraged,
Groucho Marx ultimately has to take out a mortgage on his home. And it becomes a spiral after that.
Another person who's really hurt during the crash is a certain British leader who, again, intersects on this first day of the book. How unbelievable. Charlie Mitchell is trying to figure out, how does he save his company? How does he stop this crash from coming? And that night, he goes up to his beautiful house on 5th and 75th.
It's so wild.
And he has to keep a brave face because he's having dinner with
Winston Churchill. So I didn't appreciate this until I began this project. Winston Churchill happens to be in New York, of all things, literally had just visited the New York Stock Exchange as the crash is happening.
My God.
And all of the main characters in this book who are running all the major banks, as the night the crash is basically taking place, end up having a party to celebrate Winston Churchill. And Charlie Mitchell, of course, raises his glass and says, to all my former millionaires. And by the way, they were millionaires. There were, and by the way, 2 billionaires in 1929.
Wow.
Rockefeller, and there was a famous article called The Second Billionaire in America, Henry Ford.
Okay.
So we look at this, and it's 1929.
Yeah.
So let's do a little parallels to the present day. Are there any concerns that someday you'll be writing a book that says 2025 or 2026?
So I wrote this so that we could have a prequel, not a sequel. But I do think there's so many parallels that I deeply worry about. So there was no SEC, and there was no real rules back then, insider trade. So hopefully we have some kind of guardrails around things. However, some of those guardrails are being taken down. The Consumer Protection Bureau no longer exists. That didn't obviously exist back then either. Questions about the independence of the Fed. One of the big lessons of this period is that the Fed sat on its hands during this period because it was worried about the politics of the moment. It was a new institution. It was born in 1913, and they were worried that if they were responsible for tamping things down, that they not only would get hauled in front of Congress, but that the entire Fed would be eliminated. So there was a lot of things, again, in that are similar there. And then you look at some of the things happening in crypto right now, the sort of democratization of finance idea that everybody's talking about. We're going to all have 401k plans that have venture capital and private equity and private credit, all of these sort of new features. This is happening because the Trump administration just announced plans for what's called the Genius Act to allow so many of these things to take place. And so without those guardrails, there is a question about what happens. I hope we've learned some lessons from 29. I think we did. Even in 2008, a lot of politically unpopular things took place to save us. The question is whether we'll be able to make those decisions again if politics are involved.
Do you see any evidence that we will? I mean, you look at what's happening with crypto right now. It's absolute madness.
And the question is how much leverage is in the system. So every financial crisis, to some degree, is how much debt, how much borrowing has taken place. Right. And the scariest part today is we don't know where all of the leverage, the debt really is anymore. It used to be inside banks. We knew that. Now it's inside all of these, what's called the shadow banking system.
Yeah. So one thing that I think gives us some hope is there are more women involved.
Yes, they're not.
And today,
I hate to say it, but there's not a huge number of women. There's a number of female characters in the story.
Yeah.
But they are not running these institutions at the time.
Right.
Evangeline Adams is a fabulous character.
Seer, the
She's
speculator.
A seer. J.P. Morgan used to literally the man J.P. Morgan would go visit with her. And she was like an astrologer. She would tell you what was going to happen, and people believed her. Yeah. She would hang out. She had a place at Carnegie Hall. She would hang out at the Plaza Hotel, and it was extraordinary what was taking place.
But there was a women's section.
And there was a women's section at the brokerages. I mean, it was really, you could, if you were a female,
segregated.
Segregated. Even at an E.F. Hutton.
Yeah.
By the way, E.F. Hutton, do you know who owned Mar-a-Lago in 1929?
No.
E.F. Hutton.
Wow.
And he was throwing parties down there like it was,
like it was 2025.
Maybe.
1929.
So tell us a couple more of the characters in here that maybe have been lost to history. We know, of course, people know J.P. Morgan Chase. They know Hoover. They know FDR. But who are someone else that you discovered played a pivotal role that we're not remembering today?
So a couple people. There's a guy named John Raskob, who's almost like Elon Musk, helps effectively run General Motors. Creates credit. He was really the one who basically decided credit should not be a moral sin and basically starts lending people money so they can buy cars. He becomes a multimillionaire during the 20s as a stock trader and investor. He then gets involved in politics like Elon. He actually supports Al Smith on the losing side to Hoover. Then spends most of his career or the next couple of years trying to undermine the reputation of Hoover by paying off journalists, by the way, and really sort of doing all sorts of shenanigans, and then builds what is the Empire State Building. I mean, I was the SpaceX of that time. And he's sort of a remarkable figure. And every journalist would listen to every word he had to say, and people would go crazy for it all.
Amazing storytelling and storylines through this that give you a history of not just the stock exchange and the financial crash, but New York. I'm curious what bubbles, now that you've done this book and you've written Too Big to Fail as well, what bubbles are you watching that might pop, like AI?
So we talk about crypto a lot, but artificial intelligence right now is one of the most exciting things going on in the world.
Exactly.
And by the way, I think artificial intelligence long term will be like the internet.
Right.
But if you remember in 1999, not 1929,
right,
the bubble popped.
Right.
There was a hiccup, but it was more than a hiccup. It took a couple of years to get over the hiccup, and a lot of businesses went out of business and startups during that period. And I worry right now, if you look at just the amount of money pouring into this space, almost indiscriminately, a lot of leverage in the space. People don't appreciate just how much borrowing is going on to build these data centers. There's a lot of borrowing that's happening right now. And so will there be a moment at which it doesn't work anymore? There's these what I call circular deals taking place. I don't know if you noticed. So OpenAI doesn't actually have enough money to buy all the chips that it's buying. How is it affording to do this? Well, NVIDIA recently announced that it was going to invest $100 billion in OpenAI. OpenAI then takes that cash and buys its chips. So it's sort of a circular thing.
But just like you said, we can't trace the money. We can't trace the debt. We also can't look, I think, with the advent of this AI era we're going into, we can't look at the sort of economic indicators that we could even look at in 2008, because AI will create two economies, even more so than we have today.
And that's the other thing.
The rich will continue to get richer. Working class, middle class will continue to get poorer because of all the jobs that are going to be lost there.
So 1932, we had 25% unemployment in this country. Think about that. After 2008, by the way, where the height was 11%. By the way, the lowest in history was 2.5% in the 50s. So the question becomes, what happens? If AI is as successful as we all want it to be, if these valuations are to make sense, you have to have a productivity boom. Well, productivity is a euphemism for taking out costs. How do you take out costs oftentimes? People.
There seems to be a character in here that sort of epitomizes the time, more so even than Charlie Mitchell.
Who's that?
And that's Mr. Livermore.
Oh, Jesse Livermore.
Explain Jesse Livermore. Explain his part in the crash, making money, and then, again, like so many people, not being able to keep the money.
So this goes to sort of human psychology. Jesse Livermore was a short seller. He bet against the stock market. And he used to make a fortune in part of the 20s, in the early 20s. He was almost out of business, by the way, in 1929 because the stock market had gone up 90% from the beginning of 1928 to September of 1929. And he makes a gamble of a lifetime and makes about $100 million in the middle of this crisis. He was one of the winners, one of the few winners.
The Big Short of 1929.
He was the Big Short of 1929, and he was a character unto himself. He was a bit of a recluse. He used to have his own people on the floor of the exchange calling in to him what was exactly happening. By the way, there was so much manipulation, I should also say, back then, that hopefully is not happening in the same way today. Maybe happening in crypto, by the way, but maybe not hopefully in the stock market. And Jesse Livermore, unfortunately for him, was such a traitor. He lost all the money within years. He then made it again, lost it again. And there's a lot of drama. I'll give it away at the end of the book. Sherry Netherland, Fifth Avenue, if you know it. He goes into the cloakroom and shoots himself.
Oh, my God.
And he had a young banker ask him, why didn't you just keep $2 or $3 million?
Yes.
And he was contemptuous, going, why would I want to be so poor when there was so much more money to
Exactly.
One of the great tales in here. Let's turn to something.